The conflict in West Africa has not been terribly attentive to borders. There have been atrocities and killings in Liberia. They subsided for a while and went across the border to Sierra Leone. Even once peace came to Sierra Leone, the killing simply went back to Liberia. Charles Taylor has been one of the most prominent figures throughout this ugly period of West Africa's history.
Charles Taylor came to power in order to take control of the resources of Liberia, but he didn't stop there. And the war in Liberia quickly spread over the border into Sierra Leone as a way of grabbing that country's diamond wealth.
In Sierra Leone, a rebel group by the name of the Revolutionary United Front was contesting power by rampaging through the countryside, chopping off the limbs of its victims as a way of sending a message to the government of Sierra Leone that its days were numbered.
Charles Taylor, both as rebel leader and later as president of Liberia, was the primary logistical and political backer for the war in Sierra Leone.
The crimes in the Sierra Leone civil war were truly appalling, even by the standards of the worst civil war. We had mutilation, murder on a repeated basis.
Sierra Leone is remembered for the signature atrocity of limb amputation. But there were so many other horrific violations that happened. Massacres, rape of girls and women, abduction of entire families.
Appalling crimes, not for any practical purpose, but simply to create that absolutely naked fear.
Charles Taylor is viewed as the devil that is one of those responsible for the sufferings of the people of Sierra Leone.
So were they killed inside the village, or were they killed as they were fleeing?
We sent Corinne Dufka, one of our researchers, into Sierra Leone to let people know about the horrendous atrocities being committed in the course of the Civil War.
I came to Freetown, Sierra Leone, in April 1999. I remember getting out and just walking from block to block through places where there were practically still, there were ashes around, where the wounds were still fresh.
A good researcher like Corinne has to juggle the obsession for accuracy in the reporting and at the same time be able to project the humanity and the human suffering that account brings with it.
To watch Corinne Dufka taking testimony in a Sierra Leonean village is actually like watching the beginning, the germination of the justice process. This is where people finally get to tell their stories. They could see that finally someone was paying attention and maybe something would be done. And that is the beginning of justice.
The work of Human Rights Watch, the testimonies that we took, the evidence that we gathered, served to impress upon the international community the seriousness of these crimes.
The idea that people would face some kind of justice for the crimes is essential to building respect for the rule of law and a more durable peace in West Africa. That's why Human Rights Watch pressed for the creation of a UN-backed war crimes tribunal in Sierra Leone.
The special court, to be relevant to the Sierra Leonean population, has to raise what I call the culture of low expectations. The Sierra Leoneans don't expect there to be justice because they're poor, because they're powerless, because they're unemployed, because they're from a village, because they can't read and write.
The prosecution of Charles Taylor is significant because there are very few heads of state who have been brought to justice.
The status of being a sitting president is no longer an absolute bar to indictment when it comes to the mass slaughter of innocent civilians, the forced displacement of populations on the basis of their ethnicity, or the use of rape as a weapon of war intimidation.
Charles Taylor supported the Revolutionary United Front until the Sierra Leonean War ended officially in 2002. So then another rebellion began to unseat Charles Taylor. And eventually in 2003, he was driven from office as the capital, Monrovia, was about to fall.
The civilian population was really suffering from the back and forth between Charles Taylor's troops and those of the rebels. It was a very brutal ending of power of Charles Taylor.
And at that stage, the U.S. government was able to convince Nigerian President Obasanjo to take Taylor out of Liberia and give him temporary exile in Nigeria. The problem was that Obasanjo was determined to make it permanent.
It became very important to make sure the Nigerian government turned him over to the special court for Sierra Leone, which had indicted him for his crimes. But that required an all-out effort, not only by Human Rights Watch, but in concert with a lot of other groups, international groups, but particularly Nigerian groups.
You launch a campaign. That's all you have to do. You launch a campaign. What is a campaign? Is you mobilize your resources. You mobilize your researchers. They bring you the facts. You get the lobbyists and devise a strategy.
Our advocacy meant countless press releases, working with diplomats, discussing with them the issues.
Human Rights Watch helped convince the entire UN Security Council, including the US government, to underline that exile was only temporary.
That advocacy, it focused the issue of Charles Taylor in the agenda of international criminal justice.
When I met with Obasanjo in Abuja, he made clear that he would only turn Taylor over to justice if a democratically elected president of Liberia were to make the request. Now, that sounded like something that would never happen. I'm sure Obasanjo was calculating that any Liberian president would not dare request Taylor's surrender for fear of getting killed.
And when Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was elected as the new Liberian president, that gave us an enormous, fresh point of leverage.
Given what she inherited as the president of a devastated country, her demanding Charles Taylor's surrender was not a top priority. Some pressure and encouragement was necessary, and to her credit, she rose to the occasion.
I've just said, we've said to President Obasanjo, it's time to bring the Taylor issue to closure.
When Obasanjo finally understood that he would have to surrender Taylor, he began to play games. He made an announcement saying, I'm not Charles Taylor's custodian. I'm not his jailer. Come and get him. It sounded great in principle, but in reality, it was an invitation to Taylor to flee.
You didn't need to be with Scotland Yard or Interpol to understand that Charles Taylor was going to take that as a signal to get the hell out of town, which he did.
President Obasanjo was scheduled to meet with President Bush, and there was a lot of outrage in the U.S. Congress on the fact that Taylor had disappeared.
And Human Rights Watch helped convince the Bush administration to make clear that Obasanjo was not going to get to meet with President Bush without actually surrendering Taylor to justice. And at that stage, Taylor was in fact handed over to the special court.
To see him actually in captivity and under indictment with handcuffs on him was an incredible moment.
I saw all of it. And you should see the reaction of the people of Sierra Leone. There were people in rooftops shouting that the devil has been brought to face trial.
For me, the story of Charles Taylor shows Human Rights Watch at its best. We had one of our top researchers bringing to public attention atrocities that up until then had been hidden. We used our advocates around the world to generate pressure on the governments in question to halt the atrocities. And most important, we didn't settle for an end to the killing. We insisted on a signal being sent that if you start killing people and chopping off their limbs, you will be brought to justice. You will have your day in court, and your liberty for the rest of your life is what's at stake.
It's a lesson for would-be dictators. It is a lesson for them. Charles Taylor was brought to the court with a small bag. He had, I think, 2 rings, a chain with a cross on it, and I think 2 cell phones. This is a man who was dejected. I was there. This is a man who thought that he was a god, that is untouchable. And today, look at him in handcuffs. He sends a loud and clear message to would-be dictators that you can run, but you cannot hide. One day, justice will catch up with you.
However much joy there was in our hearts was magnified and amplified thousands of times for the people of Sierra Leone, who never believed that a big man like Charles Taylor could be brought down. But he was. And he was brought down by the people in Sierra Leonean villages who told Corinne Dufka their story. They brought Charles Taylor down. Justice makes a difference.
The Mexican government estimates that there's about 120,000 to 130,000 women that are raped every year.
In Mexico, you do have a law that is evolving in that it allows women who've been raped to have legal access to abortion. And the problem really has to do, as so often happens with women's rights, the implementation.
If you're raped and you get pregnant, the way people explained it to me was, I thought it couldn't get any worse. And then I realized I was pregnant.
While the law guarantees women access to abortion, in practice, doctors, health officials, and others delay the process, and they just set up infinite hurdles for a woman who's already in a very precarious state.
We found that public prosecutors basically assume that the girl or the woman is guilty until she can prove otherwise.
So you have this law and you have people who, for a variety of reasons that include lack of information, lack of money, government obstacles directly, can't access the service.
And then you go to the public prosecutor and the whole examination starts because the public prosecutor wants to make sure that you really have a right to an abortion. In Mexico, for example, if you're raped by your father or by your brother, then that's defined as incest, and that's defined as a consensual relationship.
So can the woman in Mexico who's been sexually assaulted, as soon as possible, get an abortion and have this ordeal be over? And for many women in Mexico, the answer is no. But someone like Veronica Cruz ensures that a greater number of women are able to exercise their rights under the law.
She says, we're using the law. We will hold the state accountable to the extent that we can to show that they're not doing what they need to do. And she'll help the women file the report and do the paperwork and do everything that they need to do in order to get a legal abortion.
So often women feel so alone, and they feel a certain amount of shame with what they've gone through. They're grappling with their own feelings about a complicated issue.
One of the women that we went to see was a woman who had two daughters that had both been raped by the same man. These are young girls, you know, they've already been through so much. One of them got pregnant, and she said, I've done everything that I can. I've put my daughters through this ringing machine of the public prosecutor's office, and they're not doing too well. Veronica said, we'll follow up on your case, and we'll help you get this to the press. We have a lawyer. Whenever we walk out meetings that we've had with rape victims, the first thing Veronica does is grab her cell phone. She'll call the public prosecutor's office, constantly just moving ahead with these things. I've never seen her fall down on any of the promises that she's giving these women.
The thing that she has that makes her an incredible activist is a clarity of vision and a relentlessness in her desire to see justice. The first injustice was the rape, and I think that she kind of dedicates herself to making sure that there's not this second injustice of denying this woman or girl an abortion.
Zimbabwe is a former British colony in southern Africa. It was formerly known as Rhodesia. When Zimbabwe was fighting for its independence, President Robert Mugabe was viewed as a hero of the people, a fighter for independence, for black rule within the region. But at the present time, he is brutalizing his own people. He's repressing his own people.
The country in general is in a complete disarray. People are starving, people can't get work, people are not happy, and they want him out.
President Mugabe is determined to hang on to power no matter what.
He presents himself as some kind of great rescuer of the nation. In fact, I think many Zimbabweans would argue he is in effect becoming the destroyer of the nation.
Mugabe cracks down on anybody who criticizes through visits from the police and the state security agents, through torture in police cells.
Hundreds of human rights activists, hundreds of journalists have been arrested for challenging President Mugabe's rule. In the aftermath of the parliamentary elections in 2005, President Mugabe decided to punish the opposition by destroying its strongholds in the urban areas.
There was an extraordinarily horrific operation, the forced eviction of hundreds of thousands of people from their homes, which had the brutal name of Clean the Filth.
Filth is people. They brought in hundreds of police and they cleared 700,000 people out. They burned down their houses, their structures that they lived in. They often beat people.
Police forcing people to destroy their own homes at gunpoint, moving people from the urban areas in trucks and taking them to the rural areas of Zimbabwe, where the government feels it will have greater control of the people.
Arnold Sunga is a leading human rights lawyer and defender.
In his role as the director of Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, Arnold has represented hundreds of community activists, journalists, other lawyers, anyone who tries to advocate for their rights and ends up in President Mugabe's cells.
He's very much an advocate for the rule of law. He uses the existing laws to try and get justice. Arnold went to court on behalf of many of the people being evicted to try and put a stop to it. It drew attention to the fact that these evictions were illegal even under Zimbabwean law.
Arnold will not be intimidated. He refuses to be intimidated. There is a lot of fear in Zimbabwe. They know what Mugabe is capable of. They've been killed by Mugabe's police and Mugabe's army. They have been brutally raped by Mugabe's youth militia. Arnold himself has, on a number of occasions, been beaten up.
He receives very serious death threats. He is constantly subject to a knock at the door. But Arnold keeps fighting. He keeps speaking out.
He believes in what he's doing. And I think that is the key. It brings hope that justice will eventually prevail in Zimbabwe.